two women who were riding the world's tallest slide when a young boy was killed.
6 went to the park, 5 came back.
The Rising crew found the man's body in that manhole early this morning.
Victor Murillo remembers the cold November night in 2009 when his son Larry disappeared. He says his wife and another friend got up early that morning to find him, but they never picked up a trace, as if the earth had swallowed him whole.
The day after Thanksgiving, November 27th of 2009, a family's joyful reunion in Council Bluffs, Iowa had just gone wrong. Over the dinner table, an argument broke out, escalating into a heated verbal clash between the parents and their son, Larry Murillo-Moncada. In a fit of rage, the 25-year-old stormed out of the house, barefoot and in the middle of a blizzard. He left behind his phone and car keys with no warm clothes to protect him from the cold. While the parents were naturally worried, Larry had pulled similar stunts before, always returning after a few hours, so they expected he'd come back this time as well. However, he didn't. The parents waited all night, but when he didn't show up, their concern turned into unease. Larry's father and a family friend went out searching for him, but despite their efforts, they came up empty-handed. The family then contacted the police, who launched a search that lasted several days, then weeks, and eventually months, but Larry seemed to have vanished without a trace. It wasn't until 10 years later that they discovered his whereabouts less than a mile away from his house, except that he was found in a way that was not only horrific, but also very strange. After his family moved from Honduras in Central America to the United States, when he was young, he never quite adjusted to his new surroundings. What started as a concern grew worse over time, and by the time he hit 25, he was dealing with some pretty serious mental health issues. He was prescribed antidepressants, but their effectiveness was inconsistent. Sometimes they helped, but other times they only piled on more frustration and anxiety. To make things worse, he had a bunch of side effects that seemed to make his condition even more challenging. He'd often talk about experiencing hallucinations, like feeling as if someone was chasing him or hearing a strange voice in his head telling him to eat sugar. He also struggled with cardiac arrhythmia and believed that eating sugar would somehow make it go away. While this was a pretty difficult situation, there was one place where Larry found a bit of solace: the supermarket where he worked. There was something about that place that seemed to soothe him. Maybe it was the friends, or perhaps the environment. Whatever it was, Larry spent more time there than at home, which didn't go unnoticed by his family. After his Thanksgiving shift on November 27th of 2009, he came home feeling pretty out of sorts. His parents tried to help him out, and the family sat down at the dinner table to chat, but Larry wasn't having any of it. He started arguing with his parents, and things quickly escalated into a heated situation. Frustrated and angry, Larry stormed out of the house in the middle of a heavy snowstorm. He was only wearing a navy blue hoodie and light blue pants, which would do nothing to protect him from the freezing cold. To make it harder for his parents to follow him, he left his car keys and cell phone behind. His parents, though, who were used to him running off but always coming back, didn't panic right away. They waited through the night, but when Larry still didn't show up, they started to worry. Larry's father, along with one of his close friends, set out to find him. They combed the area, reached out to his other friends, and when that didn't work, they put up missing person flyers around the neighborhood. Eventually, they went to the police and filed a report. For the next several months, authorities were relentless in their search for the missing guy. What started as a routine operation quickly turned into one of the most baffling cases ever. They even considered the possibility that he'd been kidnapped or worse. Despite their best efforts, every lead seemed to fizzle out. Eventually, after years of dead ends, the case was put on hold. Larry's heartbroken parents had to come to terms with the gut-wrenching reality that they may never know what happened to their son that night. No one had answers for nearly a decade until January 24th of 2019. On that day, just under a mile from Larry's house, the supermarket where he had worked at was being cleared out. The place had been closed for 3 years, and on January 24th, a team of workers were sent to remove the shelves and freezers. While going about their work, the crewmen had no idea they were about to stumble upon something truly unexpected among the items. Behind one of the 4-meter or 13-foot tall freezers, a decaying mummified human body was found stuffed at a weird angle. The crew totally freaked out and called the cops right away. Since the body was way too decomposed for a visual ID, they sent it off for a DNA test. That's when the police dug up Larry's missing persons case from 10 years ago and matched the clothes of the body with what he was reported to be wearing when he disappeared. The following week, the DNA test confirmed it was him, dead and rotting away for a whole decade. The big question now was how the 25-year-old ended up stuck there. At first they thought maybe someone had killed him and hidden the body, but the autopsy showed no signs of physical trauma, so that theory was quickly ruled out. After a lot of thinking, investigators finally came up with an explanation for the strange turn of events on the day Larry went missing. Following the heated argument with his parents, Larry went back to the store where he'd just finished his shift a few hours earlier. Since he was off the clock, no one knew he was there. The 25-year-old climbed up onto the giant refrigerators in the storage area, which was a space typically used for stock, but also where employees would hang out during breaks. Larry sat there for a while trying to calm down before he somehow slipped behind the massive machines into a narrow gap at an awkward angle. Once trapped, Larry's situation became dire. He began screaming and crying out for help, but his pleas went unnoticed. The store was noisy, and with the giant freezers humming and clinking, it drowned out his desperate cries. As the hours passed, Larry suffered from severe dehydration and suffocation and died in that horrific, claustrophobic space just a few feet away from his coworkers who remained blissfully unaware of his ordeal. Over time, his body left in the cramped, dark gap began to undergo the mummification process due to the dry conditions of the storage area. The place was already known for its unpleasant odors, so the smell of his decaying body didn't stand out to the employees who had become desensitized to such odors over time. The customers, though, who entered the portion of the store noticed a foul smell, but couldn't have imagined the dead body was hidden behind a freezer. Larry's body remained hidden for 7 years while the store was still open. After the store closed, it stayed there for another 3 years before the horrifying discovery was finally made. It's December 20th of 1928, and after 2 long weeks of relentless search efforts, a rescue plane flying over the Grand Canyon National Park in Arizona finally spotted something promising. Down below, floating on the Colorado River, was a small wooden boat, which could be the break the rescue team needed to locate the missing couple they'd been desperately searching for. Exactly 32 days earlier, they were last seen about 220 kilometers upstream, but they never showed up at their intended destination, triggering a search operation. The couple, 30-year-old Glen Roland Hyde and 23-year-old Bessie Louise Haley, had been attempting to set a speed record on their honeymoon, navigating the rugged Colorado River. But somewhere along their ambitious journey, things had gone terribly wrong, and they disappeared without a trace. So when the research plane finally spotted their boat, rescuers rushed down to the rocky riverbank, hoping to find the couple or at least some clue on what had happened. However, what they found only raised even more questions. Instead of a wreck or anything that looked out of place, the boat was in perfect condition, upright and fully stocked, even with Bessie's diary still inside. The only thing missing was the couple, as if they had vanished from the face of the earth all out of nowhere. Glen and Bessie's story kicked off in 1927 when they crossed paths on a passenger ship bound for Los Angeles. Glen, a farmer from Idaho, had just wrapped up an epic adventure where he boated all the way from the Salmon River to the Pacific Ocean in a scow he had built with his own hands. Bessie, on the other hand, was a free-spirited artist with a passion for theater and poetry from her student days. The moment she met Glen, they instantly felt a connection, and the two quickly started spending a lot of time together. There was just one complication. Bessie was already married, but things took a turn the following year when her marriage ended. Wasting no time, the couple tied the knot the very next day. To kick off their life together in a true adventurous style, they planned a honeymoon that was as unconventional as their romance. Back then, extreme sport athletes like mountaineers and skiers were gaining celebrity status. Glen and Bessie had an idea. If they could conquer the wild Colorado River as it raged through the Grand Canyon National Park in a homemade scow, it would be a game changer for them. At that point, only 45 people had ever completed that full journey, and the stakes were high. Not only would it make them famous, but Bessie would also become the first woman to achieve the feat, setting a brand new record. Glen had plenty of rowing experience under his belt, but Bessie was a newbie when it came to this kind of adventure. Still, the promise of glory and the thrill of sharing such a once-in-a-lifetime experience with Glen were too tempting to pass up. She was all in, ready to embrace the risk for a shot at making history. In early October 1928, they made their way to Green River, Utah, where Glen crafted a 20-foot wooden sweep scow exactly like the type used by river runners back in Idaho. On October 20th, they set off down the Green and Colorado rivers, aiming to reach Needles in California by the first week of December. The beginning of their journey was smooth sailing. They had packed plenty of provisions, and Glen's skills in river riding and boat building kept them afloat through Colorado's wild waters. To make sure their adventure got the attention they felt it deserved, they met up with a few people along the way. One of them was a well-known photographer, Emery Kolb, who had a studio on the southern rim of the Grand Canyon. Kolb was also an experienced river rider who knew the Colorado River's volatile nature, and he quickly noticed that Glen and Bessie weren't carrying life jackets. When he pointed it out, Glen laughed it off, saying they were already halfway through and hadn't had any issues so far. Back then, life jackets weren't a must-have for river riding, and it was up to the individual to decide what safety measures to take. However, it wasn't just the life jackets. Glen seemed to be rushing through the journey, focused on making it to their destination as soon as possible. Bessie, on the other hand, wasn't quite as sure. She looked hesitant to get back into the boat, perhaps from the exhaustion of the journey so far, or maybe it was the fear of the dangerous rapids ahead. Kolb could see that Glen was pushing her to continue, even though she didn't seem fully on board. Before they boarded the boat again, Bessie caught sight of the outfit Kolb's young daughter was wearing and commented, "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." That simple remark made Kolb realize that Bessie had already sensed they weren't fully prepared for what lay ahead, though by then, their fate had already been sealed. Kolb bid them farewell, but his photography friend stayed with the couple for a few more kilometers. They parted ways at one of the Colorado River's more challenging spots due to its Class 5 rapids, known as Hermit Rapid. On November 18th of 1928, those fierce waves at Hermit Rapid became the last place Glen and Bessie were seen alive. The first week of December came and went, but Glen and Bessie never made it to their destination. Their families grew concerned, sensing something was wrong. After a couple of days, a full-scale rescue operation was launched to find them as quickly as possible. 2 weeks later, their boat was discovered, but there was no sign of an accident or any clue about what had happened to them. Bessie's diary, found on the boat, had entries up until November 30th, showing they'd been on the water for another 12 days after they were last seen. According to Bessie's notes, they had actually been ahead of schedule, making it as far as Diamond Creek, which was several kilometers ahead of where their boat was eventually found. The search for them continued for years, but it led nowhere. Glen and Bessie were presumed dead. That is until 1971, when the story made headlines again due to a woman named Elizabeth Cutler. During a river tour of the Grand Canyon, she sat around the campfire and shocked everyone by announcing that she was Bessie Hyde. She claimed that during her trip, she had stabbed and killed Glen after a heated argument and had been living a secret life ever since. What's more shocking was that her age seemed to match what Bessie's would have been if she'd survived. This bold statement didn't go unnoticed. A reporter tracked Elizabeth down for an interview to get more details, but when faced with the pressure, Elizabeth backed off, claiming she had never even heard of Bessie Hyde. It's likely that her statement was a prank to get some attention. Glen and Bessie had become local legends, with tourists exchanging their story every time they visited the Grand Canyon. She probably overheard it during her trip and decided to jump in and make a name for herself. Although it turned out to be a fabrication, the rumor that Bessie survived the canyon wouldn't die. In 1972, legendary Grand Canyon river guide Georgie Clark passed away, and when people went through her belongings, some strange details came to light. For one, Georgie's birth certificate revealed that her name wasn't Georgie, it was Bessie DeRoss. Among her provisions was the marriage certificate of Glen and Bessie, along with a pistol. This got people talking that Bessie might have been living under an assumed identity. However, Georgie was a famous figure, and her early life had been well documented. Her childhood photos didn't resemble Bessie at all, so experts concluded that their same birth names were just coincidental. The marriage certificate likely made its way into Georgie's possession because of her long career as a guide in the park, where she had probably come across some of Glen and Bessie's documents. All these odd bits and pieces probably just fed into the wild speculation that had been swirling for years. In 1972, another strange twist came into the play with death of the photographer Emery Kolb. Almost a year after he passed, a skeleton was found in the garage of his abandoned studio. It belonged to a man in his 20s who seemed to match Glen's height and build. But unlike Glen, the man's cause of death was clear. He had a bullet hole in his skull. For nearly 30 years, Kolb was suspected of killing Glen, until 2008 when it was revealed that the man in Kolb's garage was actually an unidentified person who had taken his own life back in 1933. Still, the question of how his remains ended up in Kolb's garage remained unsettling, but it was clear that Kolb hadn't murdered him, and it definitely wasn't Glen. With all the theories and wild speculations flying around, the most plausible explanation for what happened to Glen and Bessie remains that they were simply trying to conquer one of the most dangerous sections of the Colorado River without life jackets. A small slip, loss of balance, and one might have fallen in, with the other jumping in to save them. The violent currents could have swept them both away in an instant. That theory mostly fits, but there's still one lingering question. How did their boat end up kilometers beyond where they were supposed to be, according to Bessie's diary? Either her notes were inaccurate, or the river's currents carried the boat for days, taking it far beyond their last known location. Both conditions seem a bit far-fetched, but they remain possibilities. It's been almost a century since Glen and Bessie disappeared in the Grand Canyon, and their story continues to be one of the park's greatest and most controversial mysteries. August 7th of 2016. Nathan Scwhab, the 12-year-old son of Kansas State Representative Scott Scwhab, is all fired up standing outside the pool of the largest slide in the world. He's just gone down the massive ride himself, and now he's waiting for his 10-year-old brother to follow. The two had climbed to the top together, but at the last minute they split up with Nathan going first, while his brother sat to come after him, sitting beside two other passengers. The 2 seconds drag on, each one feeling like an eternity. Nathan's excitement shifts to unease. His eyes are locked on the mouth of the slide, expecting to see his brother any moment now, laughing or maybe a little winded, but instead what comes next freezes him in place. The Schlitterbahn Kansas City Water Park authorities in 2012 were in a tough spot. The Great Recession from 2007 to 2009 had hit them hard, and their much-hyped grand opening on July 15th of 2009 was a total letdown, leaving them struggling to draw any attention for the entire inaugural season. In the next couple of years, they started making some progress, but things were still pretty rough and filled with all kinds of unpleasant surprises. So, to turn the situation around and get more people through the gates, the park's owner and his co-founder cooked up what they thought would be a brilliant plan. In November of 2012, they announced that they were going to build the world's tallest and fastest water slide, which they would break the Guinness World Record. The owner himself came up with the design and concept, but when he pitched it to the manufacturers, they weren't exactly sold on the idea, so they decided to build it themselves, a move that seemed sketchy from the start. In their rush to get this massive slide out there, Schlitterbahn's in-house crew worked around the clock, sometimes forcing the staff to give extra hours. Calculations that normally required 3 to 6 months were crammed into just 5 weeks, and in less than a year they had it ready for testing. By November 2013, the ride had a name, Verrückt, which fittingly meant crazy or insane in German. The testing, though, turned out to be another headache because the design had some major issues. The rafts used to slide down the ride kept going airborne on this massive uphill slope towards the bottom of the slide, which forced the manufacturing team to go back and make some significant changes. But everything was moving too fast because the owners were rushing to meet the promised opening date. After 9 months of readjusting things, the parks team claimed it was good to go once again. The Guinness Book of World Records named Verrückt the tallest slide in the world in April of 2014, even though it wasn't fully prepared yet. Standing at 51.4 meters, or 168.7 feet, it was taller than Niagara Falls, and broke the previous record held by Kilimanjaro in Brazil. But the same old issue was still there. Although it wasn't as bad as before, the rafts were still catching air on the way down. So just days before the grand opening, they had a few staff members test and redesign it over and over. But with the clock ticking and the pressure on, they couldn't fully solve the problem, however they managed to dial it down a bit. To play it safe, they covered the whole thing in a metal netting, so if a raft went airborne, it wouldn't fly off the slide. While they did call it a solution, it was more of a band-aid fix. Still, they got the ride open, and as expected, Verrückt became an instant sensation, shooting the park's popularity through the roof. For the next 2 years, the ride pulled in crowds from all over the world, raking in millions for the owners. But on and off, there were reports of rafts going airborne at the same spot on the slide. The park's management got the warnings, but they didn't do anything about it, even though they totally could have. That level of negligence was deadly, and the consequences were going to be just as horrifying. On August 7th of 2016, Schlitterbahn Water Park held Elected Officials Day. It was pretty much a marketing stunt where they gave free entry to elected officials and their families. Among those who took up on the offer was Kansas State Representative Scott Scwhab, along with his wife and 4 kids. The kids were all young and naturally were super excited for the rides, especially Verrückt. The Schwabs went to church that morning, packed up the car, and headed to the park for a day of fun. Once they got there, the 2 boys, 12-year-old Nathan and 10-year-old Caleb, dashed for the rides one after another, laughing and loving every minute of their adventure. The boys then set their sights on the world's tallest slide and told their dad they were going to try it. Scott advised them to stick together as they headed towards the climbing platform. He and his wife, Michelle, were chilling and keeping an eye on the younger kids from a distance. Meanwhile, Nathan and Caleb climbed up 264 stairs to get to the Verrückt. At the top, they met the ride operator who asked them to step on a scale. Both boys met the age and height requirements for the ride. The operator then sorted out the weight limits for the rafts and split them into 2 groups. Each raft could hold 3 people, so Nathan and Caleb ended up in separate rafts with 2 other passengers each. They didn't mind too much since the ride was only supposed to take a few minutes and they'd be back together at the bottom. Little did they know that wasn't going to happen. The ride's dispatch signal went green, and the operator told them it was free for them to take the plunge. Nathan's raft went first, and he told his brother he'd be waiting for him down at the end. The operator gave the raft a push, and with a burst of loud, thrilling screams, Nathan and the group shot down the slide. After a wild few minutes, he popped out of the slide and started waiting for his brother's raft. Back at the top of the boarding platform, the signal turned green again, and this time, Caleb, along with 2 other sisters, Hannah Barnes and Matraka Bates, took the plunge. The ride kicked off in much of the same way, but the excitement hit a peak as they sped down the first hill, hitting a whopping 70 miles or 112 kilometers per hour. Then they tackled the second hill, where the raft slid up at a high speed before dropping down an even steeper slope, but that's where it spiraled into a terrifying disaster. As the raft shot up the hill, it went airborne and crashed into the metal netting above. Caleb, sitting up front, took the worst hit. His neck slammed into one of the poles, and he was decapitated instantly. The 2 sisters sitting behind him suffered severe facial injuries as well, including a broken jaw and other fractures, but they fortunately survived. Hearing what happened, Scott and Michelle rushed to the scene, but people who saw Caleb's condition stopped them, saying it was far too heartbreaking of a scene for parents to witness. The first responders didn't even attempt to revive Caleb, they knew he was already gone. Soon after this, a park official approached the devastated couple and confirmed their son's death, urging them again not to view his body. Following the incident, the park was shut down immediately, and a major investigation kicked off. The research teams carefully examined the ride's structure and quickly discovered a serious design flaw in the second hill, where rafts frequently went airborne. The safety nets, instead of helping, turned out to be as deadly as the raft had just fallen off. There might have been a chance Caleb could have survived if there were no sharp poles at the impact spot. It was also revealed that Kansas allowed water parks to self-inspect, meaning the park was in charge of its own construction and safety testing without any external government oversight. Between August 31st, 2014 and August 5th of 2016, 11 ridegoers had reported injuries on the ride due to the airborne issue, yet the park's management not only ignored these complaints, but also failed to address the major design flaw. As the investigation wrapped up, the park's co-owner, the top design expert, and the general contractor were hit with second-degree murder charges, while the park manager faced manslaughter charges for hiding past incidents. Fall of the year 1982, a routine passenger bus is traveling through the city of Merced, California, heading northeast towards the rugged terrain of Yosemite National Park, with a mixed crowd of passengers aboard. Among them is a young woman named Patricia Hicks, originally from Washington, sitting quietly with her eyes fixed out the window, seemingly lost and deep in thought as the bus winds through the fading autumn colors. The 27-year-old is running from the haunting events of her past, but what she doesn't know is that what lies ahead is a path even more disturbing and unexpected. This 130-kilometer journey ends up being the last time anyone would see Patricia alive. Born on June 1st of 1954 in Washington, Patricia Marie Hicks, known to her family as Patty, came from a working-class family. Her father worked as a cabinet maker, and her mother was a manager at a local supermarket chain. Money was tight, which meant resources were always uncertain, leaving her childhood marked by a constant struggle that left its impact as she grew older. When she was in junior high, her 23-year-old brother, who had been struggling with mental illness, took his own life while serving on a Coast Guard vessel. Patricia was very close to him, and his death left her deeply shaken. Still, somehow, she kept on pushing through high school and eventually managed to graduate. During her college years, her interests grew closer with a classmate, sparking a connection that added a new chapter to her life. The duo soon got married, but things didn't seem to improve for Patricia. The trauma from her past and ongoing emotional struggles made her feel disconnected, and it didn't take long before they both parted ways in 1974. Already emotionally burdened, Patricia now became even more vulnerable. She spent a couple of years trying to heal, but when nothing seemed to bring her peace, she decided to move away from Washington to Merced in California, hoping to start a new life. After settling in her new hometown, Patricia discovered a local church called San Anda, founded by a man named Donald Eugene Gibson. Known for his mysterious and magnetic personality, Donald worked as a bookkeeper and yoga teacher, growing popular in the community. On the surface, he seemed like the kind of spiritual figure Patricia could turn to for guidance, but some locals had a darker view of him. There was a belief that he was a cult leader, hiding behind the facade of a bookkeeper and yoga teacher, using his position to exploit innocent people. He would allegedly recruit them based on their looks rather than religious beliefs, eventually manipulating and abusing them for all sorts of wrong things. While Patricia wouldn't have believed it, it surprisingly turned out to be true. Donald had been involved in this dark world since the 1970s, taking advantage of hundreds of people, including several minors. Patricia didn't realize this until 1981, when Donald and several members of his group, including her, were arrested. But because she was unaware of the extent of his crimes, she was let go after agreeing to testify against him. Donald was convicted of 4 counts of sexually exploiting minors, and it came out that he had been drugging his victims with LSD before assaulting them. Despite these terrifying revelations and numerous testimonies against him, Donald was still allowed to stay out on a bond while awaiting his sentencing. Seizing the opportunity, he fled to Mexico and was never seen again. For Patricia, though, the whole experience left her completely crushed. She shut herself off from her family, and unable to deal with the aftermath, she made the decision to leave the city again, this time setting her sights on Yosemite National Park. In September 1982, 28-year-old Patricia boarded a bus from Merced to Yosemite after telling her roommate about her plan, leaving her old life behind once and for all. But what she couldn't have known was that the road ahead would lead her down an even darker and more disturbing path. After she set off, Patricia was never seen alive again. Though it was a prime camping destination, Yosemite didn't have any permanent living spots, so why would she have chosen it? And more importantly, what really happened to her? The truth of her journey remained an unsettling mystery. Merced, where Patricia lived, is known as the gateway to Yosemite National Park. In 1926, Highway 140 was built between the two locations, making it easier for visitors to reach Yosemite's stunning landscapes by public transport. For all its surreal views and majestic landscapes, Yosemite National Park attracts around 3.8 million visitors every year, and back in the 1980s this number was no smaller. Besides one of the world's biggest waterfalls and granite peaks, this park also offers nearly 1,300 kilometers of hiking trails, making it a paradise for recreation and outdoor activities. So it was quite possible that Patricia was planning to camp there for a while, take a break, and figure out her next move. Or maybe she just wandered in, with no particular plan at all. Her friends and relatives were left searching for answers that never came. Almost a year later, a family outing in the summit meadows of Yosemite National Park took a horrifying turn. While some kids were running around, they stumbled upon a torn-off human hand and forearm lying in the open. The group quickly alerted the authorities, who collected the remains. The hand and arm were severely decomposed, and animals had scavenged them. Experts estimated they had been there for at least a year, possibly frozen and decayed over the course of an entire winter season. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, nothing else related to the arm was found until 5 years later. That's when another discovery, this time a human skull, was reported just across the road from where the hand had been found. Upon examination, it was believed the skull belonged to a young woman, likely in her late teens or 20s, of either European or Hispanic descent. However, due to the limitations of DNA testing at the time, no conclusive identification could be made. Still, it was presumed that the severed hand and skull belonged to the same individual, most likely a female. For the next 2 decades, the remains were known as Summit Meadows Jane Doe in the case files of the county office. In the United States, an unidentified missing female is given the placeholder name of Jane Doe, while a male is called John Doe. It wasn't until 2009 that DNA analysis confirmed both sets of remains belonged to the same person. However, investigators were still left with no idea who she was, and no one came forward to claim her. Despite efforts by forensic anthropologists to reconstruct her face from genetic markers and skull shape, they repeatedly hit dead ends. Then in 2021, nearly 40 years later after she vanished, forensic genealogists finally identified Summit Meadows Jane Doe as Patricia Marie Hicks. As investigators searched for answers, they came across an unusual lead. Some of the officers suspected that Patricia might have been a victim of Henry Lee Lucas, who was one of the most infamous serial killers of the 20th century. Lucas, who died in 2001 while serving a life sentence, had claimed responsibility for around 600 murders in the 1980s. Among his confessions was a detailed account of killing a young blonde hitchhiker he said he had picked up near Yosemite National Park. Lucas even led officers to a campsite he described as the crime scene in the park. There, the cops found chicken bones and beer cans, but without a body, the case couldn't move forward. For a moment, it seemed like Patricia's killer had been identified, even if he had died years earlier, but when they looked into his prison profile during the sentence, things became confusing once again. While behind bars, Lucas frequently made several false confessions, claiming responsibility for murders he hadn't committed. He discovered that every time he confessed to a crime, it earned him both fame and attention, not just from fellow inmates, but also from investigators. To keep him cooperating, authorities would offer him perks like cigarettes, better food, and even trips outside the prison to supposedly revisit crime scenes. This so-called star treatment gave him an escape from the dull routine of prison life, and in a way, became his new form of entertainment. The police on the other end were also reckless with Lucas, using his false confessions as a tool for solving difficult cases. They'd feed him information, hoping he would weave into the details to make his claims appear more credible. Of the 600 confessions he made, only 3 were linked to actual murders. In Patricia's case, though, the discovery of chicken bones and beer cans at a campsite where she was killed made many people believe that Lucas could have been the killer. However, investigators don't consider this as a solid evidence of murder. At best, it suggests that Lucas might have been in Yosemite National Park around the same time, possibly even crossing paths with her. But whether he actually killed her remains unproven. Some investigators point to another serial killer active in the area, or even suggest that Donald Eugene Gibson killed her in revenge for her testimony, but again, there's no conclusive proof. To this day, what truly happened to Patricia Hicks in Yosemite National Park remains a mystery. Gernot Reinstadler was born on August 24th of 1970 in Austria, where skiing was a way of life for many. Growing up in the heart of the Alps, Reinstadler was introduced to skiing at a young age and quickly developed a natural ability on the slopes. His exceptional talent didn't go unnoticed, and he began competing in local ski races as a child, consistently outpacing his peers. By his teenage years, Reinstadler had earned a reputation as one of Austria's most promising young skiers. His speed, technique, and fearless style in downhill racing were remarkable, and he quickly progressed through the ranks of junior competitions. Coaches and ski experts alike took note of his potential, and it wasn't long before he was invited to join the Austrian national team at just the age of 20. That opportunity meant he'd get to compete in the qualifying rounds of the Laberhorn ski races, also known as the Laberhorn Alpine Ski World Cup. These races are huge, attracting around 30,000 spectators every year, making them some of the most watched winter sports events in the world. Laberhorn is a mountain in the Bernese Alps of Switzerland, sitting between Wengen and Grindelwald, just north of the Kleinschleidig. It peaks at an elevation of 2,472 meters or 8,110 feet above sea level. The downhill course here is the longest in the world too, stretching over 4.4 kilometers or 2.7 miles, which means runs take about 2.5 minutes, roughly 30 to 45 seconds longer than typical downhill races. In other words, it's the perfect stage for a fierce showdown between skiers from all over the globe. Each year, the skiers with the highest overall points and World Cup rankings get an automatic spot in the competition. However, up-and-coming talents get their shot through the qualifying rounds or training rounds that happen before the actual World Cup kicks off. Reinstadler joined these training sessions in January, just a few weeks before the 1991 World Cup was set to begin. But what lay ahead was so terrifying it not only led to the cancellation of that year's World Cup, but also changed the way downhill skiing was approached as a sport forever. On January 19th, a crowd gathered to watch him race down the slope, showing off his acrobatics during one of his training runs. The spectators cheered, clapped, and whipped out their cameras to capture his impressive skills. But just moments later, those cameras recorded something that would make everyone's skin crawl. As Reinstadler hit the final stretch of the slope, he was barreling along at around 50 miles or 80 kilometers per hour. He needed to make a sharp right turn, but for a split second, his focus wavered. He stumbled in the snow, and at that speed, he crashed into the safety nets ahead. While the impact wasn't fatal, what went terribly wrong was the structure of the nets. They had huge holes in it. His sled's sharp end got caught in one of those holes, trapping his right leg, Meanwhile, his body continued hurtling down the slope at the same horrifying speed, tearing his legs from his lower abdomen. Overwhelmed by the pain, Reinstadler lost consciousness and slid down the final stretch to the finish. Responding to the emergency, the medical teams jumped into action right away. They got to him fast and started giving him oxygen to stabilize him, and then they airlifted him off the mountain with a helicopter, rushing him straight to the hospital, where he went into surgery. His pelvis was shattered and his right leg was nearly torn off. Despite the intense effort, including multiple transfusions and a grueling 6-hour surgery, he unfortunately ended up passing away the same day. As the horrifying accident left the skiing world in shock, the 1991 Lauberhorn race was abruptly called off. The Austrian team, reeling from the tragedy, packed up and left without a word. This disaster came on the heels of a heated debate over the proposed qualification system, which critics had warned would push young racers like Reinstadler to the brink, risking their safety in a desperate bid to qualify. The accident also intensified the scrutiny of safety on downhill courses, leading to some major changes, including making the holes in safety nets smaller to prevent skis from being entangled and causing such tragedies in the future. Yellowstone National Park is hands down one of the biggest and most active geothermal areas on the planet. With bubbling hot springs, steaming geysers, scorching fumaroles, and mud spots that dot the landscape, it hosts more than 10,000 thermal features across its expansive terrain. And just like others of its kind, this activity is also driven by a massive volcanic system beneath the Earth's surface, which time and time again heats these water bodies, keeping the groundwaters boiling. Some of these steaming hot springs can hit over 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius under certain conditions. Take the Celestine Pool for example. It usually sits at about 183 degrees Fahrenheit or 84.1 degrees Celsius. But with a little seasonal change or tectonic shift, it can crank up to 205 degrees Fahrenheit or 96 degrees Celsius. Due to such conditions, while these springs are straight up dangerous and definitely not the place you'd want to be hanging around, they're also insanely beautiful, so those views still end up drawing in big crowds. For over a century, there have been 22 reported deaths from scalding in the park's hot springs, and it seems like that number might just keep climbing in the future. On July 20th of 1981, 23-year-old David Allen Kerwin and 25-year-old Ronald Ratliff were cruising across Yellowstone National Park in their truck. They were about 1,000 miles away from their hometowns and had to cross the park to keep their road trip going. But after 15 hours on the road, they were beaten, and Ronald's Great Dane, Muzi, was restless and frustrated from being cooped up in the truck for too long. Given Muzi's large size, the dog needed to stretch out and move around now and then, so they figured Yellowstone's stunning scenery would be a perfect spot to pull over and unwind. Around 1 p.m., they parked at the secluded hot spring, which still had a few people around it. Located in the lower geyser basin of the park, it was called the Celestine Pool, named after the rare mineral found there. The water was incredibly hot, and everyone knew better than to get too close, so they kept their distance. David and Ronald hopped out of the truck and opened the back seat to let their dog out. The animal was so excited that it leaped out and took off running before they could even get a leash on it. The guys weren't too worried though, as the dog was pretty well mannered and they knew it wouldn't wander off too far. So while it enjoyed its run around the field, the exhausted duo decided to take a walk to the pool. Even though it was peak summer, Yellowstone had awesome, pleasant weather, and the geothermal pool added just the right touch of warmth to the air. After soaking in the beautiful scenery for a bit, David glanced back at his dog, and sure enough, it was coming back. But then came crashing down, an event that sent shivers down their spines. The playful dog messing around with them once again ran past the duo, this time straight towards the boiling water. Before they could react, it accidentally leaped into the scalding hot spring. The splash was so jarring that people, including David and Ronald, screamed in horror. David was beside himself, unable to stand by and watch the nightmare unfold. Desperate to save the poor animal but unsure of how to help, he ended up making a mistake that only made things worse. The 23-year-old decided to take the plunge and pull the animal out. As he got ready to step in, the crowd around the chaotic scene started shouting again, begging him not to go. But David, locked in on the dog's struggle, shot back with a firm refusal. He took a few steps into the scalding water, though with all the adrenaline pumping, it didn't feel too bad at first. Then he braced himself, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and jumped in head first. That's when it hit him. He'd made a terrible mistake. The second his skin touched the water, it was like 1,000 needles stabbing him at once. The heat rushed through him, starting in his head and working its way through every inch of his body, setting him on fire from the inside out. His eyes, even though they were squeezed shut, burned from the heat around him, but he still fought through it, splashing his arms and legs for a few seconds, grabbing the dog and trying to make his way back. The pain, though, was too much. When he opened his eyes, the boiling water blinded him. He couldn't tell which way to go and went under again for a few seconds. When he came back up, the dog was gone, but now it wasn't even about the dog anymore. He was trying to save his own life. His arms were barely hanging on, but he kept on flailing, desperately trying to make it to shore. Back on shore, Ronald, already losing it, screamed and jumped feet first into the shallow water, yanking him out while burning his own legs in the process. A few people rushed over, pulling David to the side and shouting for help. David was screaming in pain, cursing himself repeatedly for going in. His condition was beyond horrible. He couldn't see, and his skin was ghost white. Once the medics got to him, the body was assessed as being 100% covered in third-degree burns up to the bones, while Ronald had second-degree burns on his feet. David endured several agonizing hours as the intense pain from the burns ravaged his body before he finally succumbed to death the next morning. And the dog he had risked his life for probably got swallowed up by the boiling water, as nobody went back to look for it. Nestled in the heart of Colorado, Rocky Mountain National Park offers a landscape that feels like a world of its own. Stretching across 1,076 square kilometers, the park features everything from sprawling meadows in the montane zone to shimmering alpine lakes and rugged peaks that rise over 14,000 feet. This diverse terrain invites hikers to explore a stunning variety of mountain environments, with over 500 kilometers of trails catering to all skill levels. Along the way, the wildlife adds an extra layer of wonder, whether it's elk grazing in the meadows or marmots scurrying across rocky outcrops. Fishing has also been one of the all-time favorite activities for tourists since the park's first season in 1915. With more than 50 crystal-clear lakes and a network of countless streams, anglers find plenty of serene spots to cast their lines and often hope for a catch like trout or other native fish species. In 2022, the park recorded its peak annual visitors at 4.3 million, which back in 1938 was still a record-breaking number, with 659,000 people immersing themselves in its trails, scenic beauty, and the thrill of its outdoor adventures. That's exactly how the Beilhartz family must have envisioned their holiday on the Independence Day weekend in 1938. On July 3rd, William Harvey Beilhartz, along with his 10 children and a few close friends and their families, headed out to camp in the Rocky Mountain National Park. The group got an early start, setting up camp that morning, and planned to go fishing at a nearby stream after grabbing some refreshments. In the meantime, William decided to take a stroll down to the river to wash up and check the conditions. As he stepped out of his tent, his 4-year-old son Alfred decided to tag along with him. At the time, 2 of William's friends had also gone off to freshen up, but they were a bit farther upstream from them. Once he finished washing up, William figured it was time to head back to camp. Alfred, though, knowing his dad's friends weren't too far off, decided to wander over and catch up with them. William walked back to camp, watching Alfred strolling upstream towards his friends. But that little boy never made it to them. The 2 friends upstream didn't spot Alfred coming their way either, and after finishing up, they made their way back to camp as well. That's when it hit everyone: Alfred wasn't with them. The family immediately started the search for Alfred. There were a dozen people at the campsite, so they figured it would be a quick find. After all, a 4-year-old couldn't have gotten far in such a short time, but their assumptions quickly proved to be way off. The group yelled and shouted Alfred's name, scouring every corner of the campsite and the surrounding area where he was last seen, but Alfred didn't appear. As the minutes turned into hours, the tension began to rise, and they decided to call in the park service for help. The park rangers immediately recognized the urgency of the situation and understood that the search needed to be expanded quickly, so they called in the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, who were working as part of a government work relief program. Within 45 minutes, over 100 CCC members arrived at the campsite to start their search. The Beilhartz family, along with their volunteers and park rangers, teamed up with the CCC, combing the area throughout the entire day. But there was still no sign of Alfred. The next morning on Independence Day, they brought in bloodhounds from Colorado State Prison to assist. Unfortunately, the dogs couldn't pick up Alfred's scent. The following day on July 5th, the search teams, assuming Alfred might have fallen into the river, decided to put up some makeshift dams to stop the flow. They knew that if he had been swept away, he would have already died by then. The teams gathered logs, rocks, sandbags, and anything they could find to block the water, and began searching the riverbed with pikes and grappling hooks, but their efforts proved fruitless. Realizing that the currents may have carried him away before the dams were even set up, they installed a wire net near the river's fall, hoping that even if his body had been swept past the dams, the net would catch it. As more volunteers and local rescue workers joined the search, the teams combed every inch of the riverbed, but there was still no sign of Alfred. It became clear that he hadn't fallen into the river, and now the focus shifted to him possibly getting lost in the forest or being kidnapped. The new direction gave them a sliver of hope that Alfred might still be alive and could eventually be found. While all of this was happening on July 3rd, the same day Alfred disappeared, a radio technician from Denver and his wife were hiking in the Rocky Mountain National Park, about 10 kilometers from where the Beilhartz family had camped. Around 1 p.m., just hours after the incident, they had stopped to take a break near the base of the 12,000-foot elevation called Mount Chapin. As they rested, they looked up and were stunned to spot a young boy sitting on a rock, hunched over in an area known as the Devil's Nest on the mountainside. The place was so strangely quiet that they could literally hear the boy making a strange shrill noise as he stared at them. He remained there for several minutes, but when the couple moved to get a closer look, they saw him either fall behind the ledge or get yanked back from the other side. Concerned about the child, the duo decided to hike to the spot, but when they reached the ledge he was sitting on, there was no sign of him. The couple freaked out and rushed back to the car. That's when they heard about a missing child on the radio. When they got home, they checked the newspaper and saw a photo of Alfred Beilhartz, and realized it was the same child they had seen in the Devil's Nest. Without wasting any time, they drove back to the park and alerted the rangers. Despite the seemingly impossibility of Alfred having made it to the top of Devil's Nest on his own, and within just a few hours, the rangers sent out a team of 150 men to search the mountain, but they too came back empty-handed with no clues to follow. By then, Alfred's parents were convinced that their son had been abducted. In response to their growing concern, the FBI revealed that a dirty bandage had been found in an abandoned cabin in the park, some distance from where Alfred had already gone missing. Alfred's mother recognized the bandage material. It matched the one she had used to treat a blister on his foot before their camping trip. On the same day, a woman living near the park saw a boy walking along the highway with a mysterious man as she and her husband drove past them. At the time, she had no idea about Alfred's disappearance, but when she saw his photo in the newspaper the next day, she immediately recognized him. Though her sighting didn't lead to any breakthroughs, it further reinforced the belief that Alfred had been abducted. If that was the case, continuing the search in the park seemed pointless. Still, to rule out any missing clues, the rangers brought in sniffer dogs once again. This time, the dogs caught Alfred's scent, but lost it in the exact area where his father had last seen him. Another set of dogs were brought in, and they too detected the scent, but their trail led them to a different spot, roughly 500 feet higher on the elevation. There, the scent suddenly stopped, and the dogs lay down, refusing to continue. The teams tried to engage the dogs forward, but they couldn't get past that point. With no progress being made, the rescue operation was called off after 10 days of exhaustive searching. On November 27th, nearly 5 months after Alfred went missing, his father received a ransom note demanding $500, which would be about $11,000 in today's money. The alleged kidnappers instructed him to leave the money in a can 1 block from their house, promising they would return Alfred within 24 hours. However, just 2 days later, police confirmed that it was a hoax, as the case had received widespread attention from newspapers. To this day, the true fate of Alfred remains a mystery, but there are some strange inconsistencies surrounding the case. One of the most talked about theories involves supernatural elements. People point to sightings of a child near Devil's Nest and the odd behavior of sniffer dogs, leading many to believe that there was something far creepier at play than just a missing boy. Others suggest that Alfred might have been abducted or even murdered, with his body buried at the spot where the sniffer dogs lost his scent 500 feet away. However, search parties never considered this possibility. And then there's the unsettling fact that Alfred disappeared right under the noses of so many people. His father seemed unconcerned about him walking alone beside the river. This has fueled speculation that Alfred may have been accidentally killed by his own family, and the entire search and rescue operation was just a cover-up. The most likely explanation, though, is the one that search parties initially believed. Alfred fell into the river and drowned. But for reasons still unclear, his body could never be found. 47-year-old Keith Masters and his girlfriend were heading out of their apartment, making their way down the building's hallway on Friday, December 13th of 2002, when they ran into their friend Kyle McGarity. Kyle, a 25-year-old bartender, had just finished his shift and was ready to start his weekend getting into the holiday spirit for Christmas. Though the two friends had a bit of an age difference, still Keith and Kyle clicked along very well, and living in the same building, they frequently found themselves hanging out together. So seeing Kyle that night, Keith jumped at the chance to invite him for drinks. Kyle was up for it, and the trio headed to the pub just down the street in Lower Manhattan. Reaching there, they had a blast and drank a lot, but on the way back, Keith started to think his friend was hitting on his girlfriend. Whether it was actually happening or if the drunk middle-aged guy just imagined it, no one could say for sure. What we do know is that Keith ended up confronting Kyle, accusing him of making moves on his girlfriend. Kyle denied it, and things quickly escalated into a full-blown brawl. Keith, being 20 years older and way stronger, gave his 25-year-old friend quite a beating. It was the weekend and the roads were packed with people. According to several witnesses, Kyle was getting tossed around like a rag doll and repeatedly slammed to the ground. He was begging Keith to stop, saying his leg was about to break, but Keith wasn't backing down. Just a few meters away from the situation, there was an open manhole. A few days earlier, a private gas and steam utility company had been alerted about a leak in an access point to a steam main buried below that manhole. The workers had been scrambling to find and fix the problem. The 4.5 meter or 15-foot deep manhole was flooded with scalding hot water and steam. The job wasn't finished yet, so the workers had put a temporary cover over the manhole with a plastic vent stack. But somehow it wasn't there at that time. In a fit of rage, Keith grabbed Kyle and, without a second thought, dragged him over to the manhole and threw him in. Inside the manhole, it was like being thrown into a pot of scalding stew, only with 3 times the heat. The water was boiling at 572 degrees Fahrenheit. Kyle was in excruciating pain as he was literally being cooked alive. By the time this nightmare unfolded, it was 4 a.m., and his frantic screams echoed from the hole, prompting people nearby to call the cops. The first officer who arrived on the scene tried to check on him, but the steam was so blisteringly hot that it was almost impossible to stand near the manhole, let alone help Kyle. Realizing the gravity of the situation, firefighters in full protective gear were summoned to get a better look at the horrific situation. Kyle was waist deep in the boiling water, his hands were up, and he was desperately trying to get help. Despite their protective gear, the firefighters couldn't safely descend because of the extreme heat, so they tossed him a rope, hoping he could somehow manage to tie it around himself so they could pull him out. But by then, Kyle's muscles were starting to paralyze, and he couldn't grab the rope. The police had reached out to the hot water supplier company, asking them to shut off the main line. However, the steam was still there, and it could take hours to cool down, so all they could do was wait. After nearly 4 hours trapped in the inferno hole, Kyle's agonizing cries eventually fell silent. When they finally managed to retrieve his body, the report revealed even more horrifying details about his final moments. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy described that Kyle had been steamed like a lobster. Experts pointed out that steam burns, no matter how severe, don't destroy nerve endings like flames do. This means Kyle would have felt every bit of pain until he lost consciousness. And given that steam at a certain temperature feels much hotter than boiling water, his ordeal was likely far more painful than anyone could have imagined. Keith Masters, the guy who threw Kyle down the well, was initially charged with second-degree murder, but those charges were dropped for undisclosed reasons. Kyle's family also tried to sue the utility company whose workers had been fixing the manhole, but that lawsuit didn't go through either. The company had supposedly closed the manhole properly, but somehow the cover went missing, and unfortunately led to tragedy.